All right, all you APUSH people, let's try to continue the Grand APUSH Timeline with this little format here, starting with the Confederation Period. It's called the Confederation Period because the United States is operating under the Articles of Confederation. 1781 is the opening date because that's when we implement the Articles of Confederation. That's when the Confederation Congress starts meeting. The Articles of Confederation had been written in 1777, had been being considered all the way along, but it's not until March of 1781 where they actually take effect. We're going to call the end of the Confederation period the dissolution, meaning when the Confederation Congress just dissolves because the new Constitution had been passed. That's what we'll call the end of the Confederation period. So what are the things that happened during this period that are big for you to note? Well, first of all, the answer is not much. That's one of the reasons why the Confederation period is not considered very successful. It's one of the reasons why the Philadelphia Convention is going to get called, because, well, the Confederation Congress isn't able to do much. But that doesn't mean they didn't do anything. One of their biggest accomplishments in 1785 is the Land Ordinance, which basically takes a lot of the western lands at the time, the part in between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River, including the part where we live, and divides it up into great big squares, 6 by 6, that are called townships, which, of course, since a lot of people live in Leiden Township, we still know that that's around today. That way of surveying the land and dividing it up in parcels was created because of this land ordinance that happens during the Confederation Congress. A little while later, we would not call this an accomplishment of the Congress by any stretch of the imagination, but 1786 is the start of Shay's Rebellion. This rebellion in Massachusetts that scares everybody so much that they go, wow, maybe we really do need to kind of fix what's going on here and give the government more power. Basically, it was rebellion that debts were still being collected in spite of an economic downturn, that people were being pinched, and the state of Massachusetts was still kind of ramping up its efforts to collect taxes. And people weren't going to stand for that, and so this rebellion that has to be put down scares a lot of the government officials, I guess we would say at the time. So in the next year, 1787, we have a second accomplishment of the Confederation Congress. It's the Northwest Ordinance. The territory that was called the Northwest would be what we would call the Midwest today. The states that are set up under the Northwest Ordinance include our very own Illinois, as well as Wisconsin, Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio. So the biggest thing that comes out of the setup of these states is that slavery is banned in the Northwest Territory. So even predating the Constitution, there were some steps being taken against slavery, and that's considered the biggest accomplishment of the Confederation Congress. But as we pointed out, the weaknesses are just too many. There's no real power to tax. There's not much enforcement power. The states are setting up economic limitations on each other, and that's just not getting resolved in the Congress like it's supposed to. So the Philadelphia Convention is called in 1787. It's about a, 4-month process, I suppose, something along those lines. And then, of course, once they write the Constitution and put it out to the people, it still has to be ratified by 9 of the 13 states. And that process is going to drag out all the way until 1789, when the first meetings, ratification technically ends in 1788, but the first meetings of the new Congress and the election of George Washington and all the rest, they're going to take office in 1789, and that's when the Constitution then takes over from the Articles of Confederation, and we would call this period closed, as we mentioned before. So one other thing to keep in mind here that we could throw in as a date, just because it's so incredibly short, if you remember the Annapolis Convention, this is going to happen right before Shay's Rebellion. It's kind of odd, but it's important to remember that there were already weaknesses in the Articles of Confederation that were strong enough that made some of the states want to meet together in Annapolis to try to say, hey, we need to fix something. And then, pretty much right at the same time, is when the rebellion in Massachusetts called Shay's Rebellion starts. So, even before Shay's Rebellion, there were people who were concerned enough to fix the government that was operating during the Confederation period.